This year's theme is It Matters How We Open Knowledge, Building Structural Equity. And this aligns with the recently released UNESCO recommendation on open science, of which open access is a crucial component. Open access makes research and scholarly outputs publicly available to everyone, free of charge and without most copyright and licensing restrictions. It accelerates scientific research and the translation of that research into new medicines, useful technologies, solved problems, and informed decisions that benefit everyone. Authors are able to reach a larger number of readers. This improves impact and broadens engagement. UTS is committed to delivering public good and broad societal benefit. To meet this commitment, the university supports the principles of open access as part of its strategy to produce high-quality research and education with community and global impact. Open access puts rich and poor on a more equal footing as it eliminates the need for payments or permissions to reproduce and distribute content. The UTS open access policy has just been revised and published in time for Open Access Week. It aims to ensure that wherever possible, UTS research outputs and scholarly works are available online and worldwide, free of charge, supporting the principles of an international open access research community. Today, we have three panelists who are going to talk to us about different aspects of open access. Verity Firth is the UTS Executive Director, Social Justice. She leads the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion and is currently spearheading the university's social impact framework, a first of its kind in the Australian university sector. Other initiatives of the Centre include equity and diversity, policy and programs, university outreach into low SES schools, the award-winning Shopfront Community Engagement Program, the UTS Social Impact Lab, and the Athena Swan Equal Futures Program. Michael Gonzalez is the UTS University Librarian with 15 years of library experience, characterised by a strong focus on seamless digital collections and service delivery. Michael continues to increase the profile of the library and expand the library's educational and research services by working closely with the university community. Liz Baker is the library's Director of Library Resources and Discovery. She's worked in a number of university libraries during her 25-year career and has seen significant changes in publishing and scholarly communication during this time. Liz oversees areas responsible for information resources, transformative agreements, and the infrastructure and services to facilitate open access. I'm going to begin by asking each of the panelists a number of questions. Then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So please enter them in the chat bar and we will take those questions a bit later on. So Verity, I'd like to start with you. Social justice at UTS, what does it mean and what does it look like at UTS?
I like to always begin, I should also acknowledge before I begin that I am on the land. I'm in Glebe at my house and I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is also the people who own the land upon which the university is built. So I want to pay respect to elders past and present. In terms of social justice at UTS, we have developed an all-encompassing, overarching social justice strategy at UTS. Now, many universities have done something similar and they talk about how they're committed to public purpose, all of which is true. But what we've tried to do differently at UTS is say, okay, if we're going to be a university genuinely committed to social justice and public purpose impact, then we need to actually track that. We need to measure that. We need to demonstrate that. And we then need to make sure that we are providing the support internally, skilling up our people, and actually delivering more than just nice words to our social justice enterprise. So at UTS, we have the social impact framework, which monitors every aspect of the university's operations. We have 6 domains of focus where we explicitly look at creating change in these 6 areas. Those areas are ensuring that we have equity cohorts actually being able to access the university in the first place. So who comes to UTS? We look at the building of social and personal responsibility in our student cohort. So what happens to them when they are at UTS? We look at ways to support our staff to maximise their social impact. And particularly in terms of the topic that we're on today, we look at how to best maximise and support targeted research, teaching and program outcomes that have social impact and actively contribute to communities. We also talk about advocacy and critical voice, and actually the university being a brave leader in this space, and of course that our business operations have social impact. All of this is measured against a publicly available social impact framework, but explicit to what we're talking about today, we say that none of this is possible unless you do your impactful work in collaboration alongside communities. And that is what open access is about, that the knowledge of the academy does not just reside within the academy, that we are actually partners in learning and partners in the creation of new knowledge, and particularly when that new knowledge is creating public good. So I'll leave it at that. But if people are interested, you can always Google search Social Impact Framework UTS, and you can see there what our framework involves and how we plan to support it, or how we do support it across the institution.
Thanks for that great summary. You touched on it a little bit already, but do you think open access to scholarly outputs can support social justice?
Absolutely, because what we see is ultimately our goal as social justice warriors within universities is to democratise scholarly knowledge, right? Like, we're actually about how do you get knowledge out there, especially when it's knowledge for the public good. And I think, as you said in your opening comment, Sally, open access puts rich and poor on equal footing for those key resources. Now, when we talk about engaged scholarship or social justice scholarship, we're talking about embodied behind this concept is the concept of different types of knowledge still being equal. So when we talk about community engaged scholarship, we actually talk about a two-way process. It recognises that knowledge creation doesn't just happen within universities. It also arises in the context of practice. So what this means is that researchers and practitioners should work alongside each other as equals. And it is that dynamic that affects change through generation of new knowledge. So in other words, what we see when we're saying we're a social justice university is that rather than undertaking knowledge work on behalf of society, universities must undertake it in active collaboration with society. And this offers the benefit of incorporating contextual knowledge and experience and basically enhancing the collective outcomes that result from such partnerships. Great value can be generated when universities build reciprocal and mutually beneficial relationships with the communities they serve, and that is best done when there's open, accessible knowledge transfer. And I just wanted to point also that the UN Sustainability Goals totally recognise this, right? So when they're talking about quality education in SDG Goal 4, they're talking about inclusive and equitable quality education. And in the Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions Goal 16, they absolutely talk about ensuring public access to information to protect fundamental freedoms.
The Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion publishes an open access journal through UTS ePress. Can you tell us why you decided to go with the open access model for that publication?
Yeah, well, for all of the reasons above that I've just said, also Gateway's journal is a journal of engaged scholarship. So it'd be very odd if we were to run a journal of engaged scholarship and not have open access. And a lot of the articles published or the papers published in the Gateway's journal are in fact collaborations between academics and practitioners on the ground and community. participants. The other thing that was really important, though, the reason why we chose to publish with UTS ePress is that we don't believe that there needs to be, nor is there, a trade-off between a wide audience and rigorous quality. Open access ensures, as far as we're concerned, it ensures that relevant, up-to-date research gets out to a wide audience and it isn't kept behind paywalls. And that's particularly important in the social justice space. The good thing about UTS ePress is that it's a leading scholarly publisher of peer-reviewed open access journals in Australia. It's committed to unlocking publicly funded research for the benefit of all, which facilitates real-world impact. And it's a not-for-profit publisher. So UTS ePress doesn't charge authors to publish or readers to access any of the digital content, and it includes all of our archived materials. So what's great for Gateways is that every single article published by Gateways will remain available for all for free. So there's, which again, huge benefit for us, particularly with Gateways, which is now a long-standing publication. It obviously, the press adheres to international standards of ethics and high quality publishing. They belong to the Committee of Publication Ethics and so forth. And we've also found that they're really good in terms of keeping up with digital technology and new forms of publishing technology. And through UTS ePress, Gateways has now been awarded the Directory of Open Access Journals seal because we adhere to exceptionally high publishing standards. So for us, and in our experience, open access and ethical high quality publishing has resulted in more of our articles being downloaded, cited and used. And the statistics are really great, actually. We have a citation statistic of 75% of our Gateways articles have been cited, which we think is really phenomenal, especially considering the sorts of work that's done in Gateways. So we chose it because we wanted to be open and accessible, but really what I wanted to push home is, for us, being open and accessible and freely available does not mean that it's not rigorous, does not mean that it's not peer reviewed, and does not mean that it isn't of high quality. And what we've found, of course, is that we really believe it's driven our readership and our citations a lot higher than we would have done if had we gone behind some paywall.
Thanks, Verity. All very interesting, very positive news. Michael, I'd like to turn to you now and ask a little bit about open access at UTS around the policy issues. So UTS has just updated its open access policy. Can you tell us what has been changed and what are the potential implications or impact? What does the OA policy mean for UTS?
Well, firstly, a big thank you to Sally, because I know Sally's been driving the update of the policy and all of the engagement. So, and it's been actually about 10 years in the making, because it was an original policy and then we've recently revised it and it was published, I think, this week. It's been completely updated and Helen's put the link in the chats. Now, in terms of what it means, and I mean, firstly, it's actually quite important for every university to take a position on this. If a university is going to say that it is there for public good, then it really needs to sort of say what we do in research is actually available to the public. And every university has come to this realization across the country. Every university has a version of open access policy in place with varying degrees. UTS has had the benefit of having one round of a policy, and with the new update sort of became a little bit freer in the sense of what it will make available, a little bit more open. But probably the most important aspect and the change is some of the definitions that are used in context of research. And it really does align us to what is a global movement. So, and it's really sort of beneficial in terms of collaboration that UTS sort of has a position on this, particularly when it starts to look at the US and the UK, where there is now looking to be national movements around being able to, having to make public funded research available to the public. So what has been changed? The definition has probably been a little bit more aligned to research policy and now includes research data. So there's a big one around what the university's position is around research data. That's a big change. The other big change is there's a lot of inclusion around how you would license. So one of the big sort of feedback from the last round is, how would you make it available? What are the requirements? What is the license? And I guess, you know, what attribution and how you would do that. So that's being clarified. The more significant part is the aspects in the position UTS has taken around open education. So probably more of a first in Australia, at least, is sort of explicitly saying we make education artifacts and things like learning objects, videos and things, we now can make them available. And there's guidance around where you would put that, how you would license that, and how that should be used. And that really does sort of change our scope completely, because it's not just about research. It is more about what it means to be an academic at UTS and a scholar at UTS. And everything you produce should be looked at through that lens of how do we make sure other people can access it. And finally, it sort of aligns to the IP policy. And that's probably the biggest significant thing about the open access policy, is that because the IP policy and the open access policy working together does actually put UTS in a position where it's actually quite sector leading, in that we have the potential to make all of our research available openly to the world if we would like to, and all of our teaching and learning materials also. So there's sort of the big changes, and it serves as a really good platform for us to actually start thinking globally and bigger and looking at the next steps. And that's sort of a big part of the work that the library will be doing the next year, is developing out guidelines and actually start looking at what we could do, what the potentiality of this platform is for UTS, and particularly in the context of its social justice sort of agenda.
So do you think UTS is ahead of the sector? Are we doing anything particularly distinct?
I think the policy itself, in terms of the sector, the elements of it are bits and pieces where you'll find it in other policies. What's distinct about us is our IP policy. And the biggest difference between us and most of the sector is our IP policy does allow UTS to publish, and it sort of explicitly makes sort of commentary around UTS being able to repurpose. The open access policy does actually say that in alignment with the IP, we are able to publish and make research outputs and teaching and learning outputs available to the world. And the biggest change that I guess operationally exists now is that we've moved from having to do 2 deposits to the repository and to Symplectic for the researchers here, to actually having one single requirement for one item to be deposited, and that's the author accepted manuscript. And that is the one bit that we can actually make available globally and immediately. So we'll be actually encouraging all researchers to actually start doing and depositing the author accepted manuscript in the first instance, so we can make that available as soon as possible.
Thank you. Are there any particularly significant international trends that we should be aware of or be taking into account? I'm thinking about Plan S, for example.
Yeah, so, well, firstly, if you step back to Verity's and the Sustainable Development Goals, that is a big one, because that actually does talk about access to information, access to knowledge, and that is one of the global trends. And all universities in this country have signed on to meet the global development goals, and that is tracked, and we have to report against that. So part of that is that, and that's sort of a global movement. The other one is every sort of district is looking at a version of something, but Europe has gotten together and has produced what they call Plan S. So Plan S is a roadmap to open access for the entire sector, and it talks about getting to a point where all research that's publicly funded is available immediately for the public or anyone to access. Increasingly important, particularly, and I think it's really interesting, if you go back to sort of what's happening around COVID and all of those sorts of things and how quickly we got a vaccine, that is because there was an open agreement to share information. So things like Plan S are designed to facilitate big thinking and collaboration and being able to, it's efficient because everyone can access everyone else's research and we can build on research. And when you bring in the data agenda, which Plan S also begins to address, you can start sort of seeing, well, our research is open, our data is open, and we need to be able to be doing that from the moment we start doing research. So Plan S is sort of a long path in Europe, and it's slowly ticking away. And part of us changing our policy was also to align to that, with the ultimate goal of being able to say that we can publish openly and we're not sort of subjected to publisher embargoes, and we don't necessarily have to consider that. And Plan S really does make a position on what type of open access is acceptable, and it's moving away from a model where we would pay to publish.
Would you like to say anything more about open education and open educational resources in particular?
Yes, and open education is slightly different in some ways because it's so varied, and what we say is an educational artifact is, you know, it can be a video, it can be a quiz, it can be a whole load of things. And in some ways, that part of the policy is a little bit more difficult to write because the infrastructure isn't in place. And that's globally. There are big repositories around the world, but so much of open education is about discipline. And you see some really interesting examples, particularly in the sciences, around discipline-based open access repositories and how they can be used and be built on. And our policy sort of encourages the publishing in the disciplines, whereby our research one says you come and we'll publish via the repository. Our open education policy says find the best in the discipline. And part of that is also increasing collaboration and working across sort of universities across the sector and sort of being able to build on that. That said, open education, although we also encourage the publishing, we're also encouraging the use of open educational resources, which is a different part. And in some ways, all of open access is about use and reuse, right? So the idea is that you publish as much as you're using. So, so you're trying to reach that equilibrium that, you know, it isn't a free-for-all of free things. The intention is that you also contribute back and sort of try and build the corpus of information. So with open education, it'll be interesting to see how we grow that in the next year to sort of try and build that culture, because a lot of this is about cultural change and being able to say to people, you know, when you publish openly and you use openly, these are all of the things that you've got to do, but ultimately you're actually building your discipline in a nice open way. So. But education is an interesting field because it's not as linear as research is, because the outputs are much more varied than research can be.
And now that we have our revised policy, how else will the library provide support for that policy?
Well, how else? Well, I can talk about what we do now. So all of our librarians can actually help you find publishing, and if you're looking at open access an option, can educate on open access and what your options are, particularly in terms of either education resources as well as research outputs. So all of our library staff are skilled and adept in being able to find the best options for you and help you on that. In the next year or so, we'll really start looking at copyright and Creative Commons and licensing, because there's a big understanding in that space as well that you need, particularly when you can use, and a lot of people, and I use this as a basic example, will put a YouTube clip into their teaching materials, for example, but every clip requires you to read a license. So you have to understand whether or not that is a context that you can use these materials in. So there's a bit of education that the library will be looking to do in the next year and sort of work with academics on that, and the LX Lab as well, in terms of being able to sort of raise awareness around the licensing aspects around that. The other part that's actually an area that we're looking to develop and provide more support is around Indigenous content, because that itself has its own requirements and actually inherently open. So when you think about Dreamtime stories and stuff, they were actually open. They were stories that were told. So it's actually interesting to look at those requirements and be able to support academic staff in being able to either research or teach and use content and publish content.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to turn now to Liz and ask her about some slightly different issues around open access. Transformative agreements are emerging on the horizon in Australia and may remove barriers to reading and publishing open access content. Liz, can you tell us more about these agreements and their benefits and how they relate to open access?
Yeah. So a transformative agreement is really an umbrella term, and it's an umbrella for a whole family of new models really that are an attempt to change traditional publishing. So another term that you might start hearing is this read and publish deal, but basically you can think of them as being interchangeable. So at the moment, UTS Library and all libraries pay a subscription fee to a publisher, and that allows our staff and students to read that paywalled content that's in that publisher's journal. Then in addition, we have some UTS authors who are paying an article processing fee, so that APC, to the publisher, and that allows them to publish open access. So we've got these two revenue streams going to the publisher. In the transformative agreement, the idea is that there's going to be one fee that's paid to that publisher, and that's going to cover both that read and publish components. So it means that in many cases, the authors are actually going to have that content published, not behind the paywall, but automatically published in the open access journal. Now, that does come with an asterisk, and can I say that there are so many transformative agreements in the world now and they're all different, but the ones that we've been looking at, it's not as simple as it sounds. So not all publishers' journals are covered in the deal, and when our APC credits run out, publishing reverts to the current model. So it all comes with an asterisk at the moment. But these transformative agreement or read and publish deals are quite new, and especially in Australia. And so we don't really know the long-term implications yet, and whether their ultimate goal, which is completely removing the paywalls and turning it just into a fee for publishing, we don't know if that's ever really going to be realised, but we're hopeful. So in terms of the benefits, on the surface, I can see that there are administrative burden. They remove administrative burdens because, you know, setting up and paying an APC is a pain. There's going to be more cost transparency. There's increased exposure for authors and potentially increases in their citation rates. And many studies are showing that if you're publishing open access, that you're getting more citations. But of course, the huge benefit really is equity to accessing scholarly content worldwide. Everyone has access. And one last thing to mention on transformative agreements, our peak body, which is the Council of Australian University Librarians, has been negotiating with a few publishers over the last 2 years or so to start bringing these deals to Australia. So rather than have universities negotiate one-on-one, we're doing it as a consortia. And we're in the final stages of assessing a couple of deals with big publishers, and we hope to make an announcement about this in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Liz. So these agreements, we hope, will have benefits in the future. Do you think at the moment APCs are going to be an ongoing barrier to wider adoption of open access in universities?
Yeah. I think that if we change nothing, nothing will change. And in our current open access publishing model, which has been around for quite a while, I think the APCs really are one of the barriers. And we could think about it as who pays APCs or question whether APCs are really needed. And Verity touched on that with UTS ePress. And in some disciplines, preprints actually dominate scholarly communication. But in the current open access model, we really don't know how much is being spent on APCs in most universities, and we just can't get the data with our current practices. And, you know, even the publishers have trouble providing us with that data. So the first challenge that I see really is getting some solid data around that so that we can properly explore and modify and create these new models that we need to. And I think the transformative agreements is going to improve APC visibility, and it's going to help us see the bigger picture and the trends that come out of this as a result of it. Don't forget though that APCs aren't the only way to have your work made open access. And, you know, as with the Gateways Journal, there are what we call diamond OA publishers, where the publisher, through funding support generally, is covering the APC. So there is no cost to the author. UTS ePress is a great example of that. And there's also the green OA, where you deposit the author accepted manuscript in the university repository so that your content becomes open access. So yeah, I think that APCs are definitely a disincentive to authors, but in a publishing industry that is dominated by for-profit publishers, it is still a challenge, and we know that there are many groups looking to make progress in that space.
You touched on the institutional repository. Opus is our UTS institutional repository. Can you tell us how it works, Liz, and how it supports open access?
Yeah. So what we're talking about there is really green OA. And I know it's confusing. There's diamond OA and there's gold and there's green and there's bronze. So this one is called green OA. And it means that if the publisher allows it, the author is able to deposit into the repository what we call the author accepted manuscript. Now that manuscript is actually the version of the paper that's provided after peer review, but before publication with that publisher. And the text is basically identical to the published version. So the author deposits it into Symplectic or via the library, and the library staff actually check each one for compliance. Now, because our authors have been providing their author-accepted manuscripts, Opus has now got over 20,000 papers that are open access, and each year about half the deposits that we're receiving are becoming open access. And of course, this means greater visibility, it means greater potential for citation increases for UTS authors, but it also means access for those who may never have had access because it's behind a paywall. So we really strongly encourage deposit of that author-accepted manuscript into Opus.
And finally, is there anything more you would like to say about how open access supports social justice?
Yes, so just thinking about the transformative agreement, thinking about it through that lens again, there's no doubt that these deals are going to be a big win for increasing the amount of content that is made open access. And so that's going to increase the equity to read scholarly information. But remember, they read and publish. So from the publishing's perspective, we know that not all researchers are associated with a university or with a university that can afford to join into these kind of deals. So their ability to contribute to the scholarly conversation via open access publishing may be diminished through this, or may continue to be diminished. And there's some concern, especially coming out of South America and Africa. So there's something called the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and some of Verity's language was definitely around that. And it talks about the rich sharing their learning with the poor and the poor sharing their learning with the rich. And this is something I'm not sure transformative agreements address at the moment, but progress sometimes just needs to be made in steps. And these transformative agreements, getting the read access out to the world is a huge first step. And hopefully that equity around the publishing access and the ability to publish is an area that's soon going to have some course correction as well.
Thank you, Liz. And thanks to the whole panel. That's the conclusion of the questions that I wanted to ask. Does anyone in the audience want to ask our panel any questions? Take up any of the issues that have been mentioned, or raise any new and different issues related to open access, of course.
I'll probably add it, although it sounds quite simple, it's quite complex. And for context, UTS spends about $12 million on resources via the library every year. And changing these models requires a lot of negotiation and things. As a sector, there's I think we do about $250 million at the Australian sector alone in terms of working with publishers and paying for access. So re-engineering these models is been sort of a long time coming, with the idea of actually just making it more beneficial for researchers to be able to get their research out there. And I think that's sort of the basic ethos is better for the world, better for the researchers, better to basically increase knowledge is sort of where we're coming from. But that's actually been quite troublesome because we are dealing with commercial people who sort of, you have to try and measure out the threats.
Thanks, Michael. I don't see any questions. Helen, alert me if I'm missing any questions. We have a question from James, or a comment from James. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for organising the panel. It's been very interesting. The question I have is really around the tension between the university's commitment to open access and the social justice aspects of this on the one hand, and on the other hand, the incentives and sometimes requirements that academics publish in high impact journals and in books with publishers that have a high reputation, because as you know, there's a very clear hierarchy there, all of which locks up that knowledge and also undermines the UTS ePress strategy of open access journals and open access publishing. So I wonder whether there may be an opportunity here for the university to move to a more coherent position on this, that perhaps charts out some future for high impact, high reputation, open access publishing through the university or perhaps its own press. I don't know, but I just, as someone who's sort of struggled with this over the last 20 years, I can see that gulf is just only getting wider. You know, some faculties now, as I say, literally require staff to publish in only in high impact journals.
I might jump in on this one if that's okay, because it's interesting because it is kind of the last year has been sort of a big shift nationally, and I think it was Kathy Foley, our chief scientist, came out and basically said that one of the 4 priorities was to have a greater sort of openness around research in Australia at a National Press Club dinner, the first one that she actually hosted. I think it was lunch. And that has actually extrapolated down to the next phase, which has been moved into more of an operations and what the government wants to explore further. And that's actually one of the areas. So in some ways, I think the sector is quite hopeful that there will be a national position on that, which actually then translates to an institutional level about what we consider to be research and what is well-performing research. And there's a lot of work being done, and it's part of, I guess, the next phase of the UTS 2027 strategy to shift away from sort of a metrics approach and move more into measuring things like social impact and research translation and those sorts of things. And I know that that's sort of the university is looking to explore that rather than the pure metrics. That said, not all open, and I think that's one of the open access myths, is that, you know, they're not high impact. A lot of them are very high impact. And in fact, Nature, who's one of the most high impact journals, has a whole load of open access journals. So there is sort of a publishing for performance and how you'd position that. And, you know, there's no real easy answer to that. And a lot of that comes down to where you are in your career as well. So, and where you should be publishing. And it's a complex sort of academic area. And I think, to your point, it's not going to get resolved in the next year or within the next period of this policy, but we can see progress towards what would be a substantial shift if we had a national agenda, which is looking to be worked on at the moment.
I just want to back what Michael says too. The more we engage, both as an individual institution, but also collectively in impact and engagement metrics as opposed to alternate metrics, the more you will see change in this area. So the ERA impact and engagement process will start to matter more, as will even UTS has now signed up to the Times Higher Education Impact Assessment for the first time this year. And again, the metrics that speak to citations and readability and engagement actually are metrics that are much more useful in that Times Higher Education Impact Assessment than in your more traditional university rankings agencies.
Thanks, Verity. We have another question from David Yates. How are the major for-profit publishers responding to the open access movement? What forms do resistance, support and cooperation take? And are the financial needs of libraries aligned or in conflict with the textbook publishers? Michael, do you want to...
I was looking at Liz. I could probably, let me deal with the textbook one first.
Mm-hmm.
Textbooks are a whole industry in themselves. You know, and it's interesting because generally they're not counted as research. So that's one part of it. So when you look at the repository, for example, we don't deposit textbooks because they're not sort of considered. So textbooks are sort of written for a purpose. They're generally around teaching and learning, and UTS is looking to look at open education resources and open textbooks a little bit more seriously next year. We're actually in the process of publishing our first open education textbook with the Faculty of Business. So there'll be more in that space and we'll start building that out. The financial needs of libraries are not aligned with textbook publishers. And that, you know, and the basic example of that is format. And I think a lot of teaching staff this year experienced that, whereby they've set a textbook and because students couldn't get to the library, they couldn't get it and the student had to buy a physical book. We couldn't get it electronically. So, and that's an area that, again, as a national body, we are continuously lobbying for and hopefully trying to get a lot of those models changed. Not very simple. in terms of the global open access movement and how are the major publishers responding to the open access movement, in terms of research and particularly journal publishing, there's become a realization that the governments are shifting their positions. So the publishers have to begin to shift theirs. Plan S was an interesting model where it initially was around gold open access, so no one lost out. So the publishers had to still get money if you wanted to pay, and all research in the UK had to be done via gold open access at a fee. What that led to was a national fund being done and being depleted within about 6 to 8 months, because essentially everyone started publishing, publishers started accepting the money, and this whole industry around grants for publishing started. So that's part of the next iteration of that. And part of it now is actually, how do we work with publishers to make sure that they can still stay in business and we're not putting whole industries out while still being able to leverage what we've got. And a lot of that comes down to leveraging existing expenditure. So no one loses out in that sort of system. So let's look what we already spend. How do we use that in a different way? And one of the things the chief scientist, for example, is looking is at a national approach to that. So one of the things she's been sort of working with I think it's called the community of scholars. So the heads of all of them is actually start to look at how you could possibly look at a national approach to having a very green, very open, and using existing expenditure and what that might look like. There's no simple answer. And what forms of resistance and support and cooperation take, it's varying depending on the publisher. And there are some publishers, and I won't name any, but who are very much resistant. And, and publishing is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And recently, I think Liz talked about, one publisher being bought by another and the scope of what they do and the services that underpin a publishing house. So we might know them as a publisher, but there's a whole load of services that they have that isn't just the production of a book or a journal, but really they do manage now the whole process of research, and the systems that are in place are basically about research management from beginning to end. So it is sort of working in that construct as well.
And it's interesting too, there was a publisher we were talking to recently who, supports open access. Remember, there are different kinds. There's gold OA and green OA, and when you submit your publication to that publisher, you can't actually get the author accepted manuscript, so that final version before publication, they don't give it to you. And so how then can we take that and put it into the repository? So there is support, but there's the claim that our system doesn't allow, can't allow that process to happen. And so there is also not support or resistance in that area. So it's a difficult one.
We have another question from Tiziana. On metrics, one concern she has is that impact, citation and social translation metrics discourage more theoretical blue sky and primary research, which compounds the trend towards favouring market-driven and industry-friendly research already dominant. Can OA be shaped to avoid this? Would anyone like to answer that one?
I'm going to point to Verity in this one because of the social impact framework, particularly as that starts growing. And from my perspective, it's about universities and institutions looking at things in different ways. And it actually is about the full story that we tell. Impact and citation metrics are one thing, and that is actually about the end, but I think the theoretical blue sky might be looking at things slightly differently, and that's where things like social impact framework comes in.
That's right. That's what I would say too, which is it depends how you measure your impact, right? So you're right, in a really narrow definition of immediate impact, yes, it does discourage more theoretical blue sky and primary research, but that's not how we measure impact at UTS in relation to our social impact framework. We're a lot more nuanced than that because we recognise, particularly for social impact, it can take a very long time, and also that you're not necessarily, how do you even prove impact? Like there's all sorts of methodologies around social impact that are actually about your contribution to the end goal rather than your direct proven causal impact on the end goal, if you know what I mean. So I suppose what I would say was we're very aware of that in terms of our social impact framework metrics, that we're not just prioritising stuff that's immediately obvious, but that we're actually recognising the complexity in the demonstration of social impact. The other thing I would say too, again, which speaks to the metrics, something like the Times Higher Education impact assessment, although there's lots of argument, like it's not uncontroversial in the way that it's measured, etc., it explicitly looks at your contribution towards the goals of the SDGs, right? So it's, again, it is attempting to take a more nuanced approach to the contribution that your research makes, or the contribution that your teaching makes overall to the end goal that is the SDG goal, right? So you're right, if you're really narrow and traditional in the way that you measure impact, which is not what we're doing at UTS.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Just on what Verity just pulling on that, and at a national level, I know that the work that's being done by the government around this is looking at different ways that open access needs to consider research, and that's why they're using, I think it's called, it's a name for it, the Academy of the Sciences is involved heavily in this, and actually looking at what we do around the conceptual stuff, what we do around the stuff that has a really long tail, and what those metrics might be looked like. So it actually is being considered, and I think we're very fortunate to have a chief scientist who not only sort of is taking a very scientific approach, but also understands that there is a breadth of scholarship, that it isn't just journals, but there's a whole load of things that have to be considered if we want to have a national position on openness.
Thanks, Michael. So I think we've finished with all of the questions now, and we're drawing the session to a close. Is there anything that any of the panelists would like to finish off with? Any other comments that you would want to make? Or do you think we've done open access to death?
No, I actually think we're just getting started. And I think, I mean, this is the exciting part, that in some ways we're getting the infrastructure in place, and we're actually in a position now where we can grow on really firm foundations. And you'll start seeing guidelines, and you'll start seeing increased support and more information coming in the next year or so. And hopefully we can also have a national position that we'd actually be able to grow that from also. So it'll be really interesting, and how we look at all of these things, particularly in the next, I would say, 2 years, because I think it's a landscape that will mature very quickly. You know, and it's one of those positives that have come out of a global pandemic, is that in both research and teaching and learning, there has been a complete awareness now of how limited access to scholarship can be.
Any other concluding comments? All right, well, we'll wrap up the session now. On the library website, under Celebrating Open Access at UTS, and I think on the slide, which is probably showing at the moment, or if not, will momentarily, you'll note that there are several additional OA panel sessions and workshops that are being held this week. So if you would like even more information about this, please have a look and see what is available. There is also a link to a podcast of an interview with Peter Suber. Peter Suber is the director of the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication and the Harvard Open Access Project, and he is an international mover and shaker on the open access front. And he had an interesting discussion with Scott Abbott, our library's Scholarly Communications Manager. So if you'd like to listen to that interview, there is a link there on the library's website. And finally, if you would like to give us any feedback on this session, please do that. And we've also had a number of links and information put into the chat as well. So that's been very helpful too. So I would like to conclude the session now. Thank you to our panel, Verity, Michael and Liz, and thank you to our audience. It was a very interesting session. And as Michael said, open access is going to become more and more important. as time goes on. So this is really just the beginning. So thank you to everyone, and this will end our session. Bye.